How many of you know what a talking stick is? Talking sticks have been used by tribal cultures, and here's a person who makes them. And the only rule for the talking stick is the person holding it just talks about what he or she's aware of without selling, and then you pass that on. So as I look out into the audience, and I think of the title of this, Why Cope When You Can Heal and Thrive? What I'm seeing is people who that speaks to because they've had traumas, they've had issues that they cope with. And some maybe they've gotten over with, but there are some that you cope with and you're just not the same. You're tentative. You don't fully trust. If it's been a traumatic relationship, you're scanning the other person and they're paying for the sins of the one that traumatized you. If you made a stupid investment, you don't want to make another stupid investment. And so as I look out to you, I'm thinking that if we could pull off giving you a way to not just cope, but heal and thrive, that'd be pretty cool, right? Are you game? So I know they like to give takeaways, so I'm going to give you a really easy takeaway to begin with. Because when I also work with the wounded warriors, and they're coping with a lot. And so I see a lot of gravity in this situation. So to begin with, maybe, and you're going to see everything you need to know about coping, healing, and thriving from these slides. And all you have to do is rent this, and you can teach someone else. So how many saw that movie? So if you didn't see that movie, and it's a long movie, Sandra Bullock is an astronaut. She's out there, and she's there with George Clooney, and to use the hero's journey, she's called into this adventure. Actually, she had a previous trauma. Her only child daughter died, and so, as she says later in the movie, I just keep driving, driving, driving. So she's called to this adventure, and it seems to be going along okay. And then what happens is there's a big space storm, and it just cuts off communication, kills a bunch of people, and then what happens is she looks to Clooney as her mentor, and there's a point at which she's tethered to the mothership and tethered to him. And there's a point, and when you think about it, one of the things that keeps us grounded is that we're tethered to a goal, to a future, to hope. And when that future, goal, hope gets wiped away, we can go into free fall. So what he says is, we're going to both die, so I've got to let go. And then when he lets go, she goes into free fall. You can see the panicky look in her eyes. And when you go into free fall, what happens is when you're not tethered to a goal and you're not grounded because she's not connected to the earth, they can't reach her. So think of that. You're not tethered to a goal and you're not grounded. And if you think of your brain as having a thinking brain, a feeling brain, and an action brain, what happens is when you're not tethered at the top or grounded at the bottom, they start to pull apart. And think of those words, wigged out of sorts, flipped out. And so she gets to a point where she thinks she's going to die. And in the hero's journey, that's the abyss. And in fact, many people will want to die because it just hurts so much. And then what happens is the ghost of Clooney comes back. And he's like a mentor. He's like a mentor that you could call on during those dark times. And I'm fortunate because I've had 6 mentors. They've all died. And when I hit a low point, I call on the Dead Mentor Society. And I call on them, and they're very responsive. They have different accents, but they're just there. They're telling me you'll get through this. And all through the movie, of course, what's really fascinating is we're the third wall. So she's telling us everything she's thinking, everything she's feeling, everything she thinks she can't take, what she wants to do. There's a point at which she wants to die. But then this point, at the low point, she's able to internalize his mentoring. And there's a good word to write down if you're in the world of mentors. I'm thinking of writing a book on it. It's called tether love. Because what mentors do, if you've been lucky to have one, that's different than a coach, a teacher, or a supervisor. They believe in you, they see value in you, and they connect you to a future that maybe you can't see, but they ground you with love. That's the difference, I think, between a mentor and a coach and a teacher. Make sense? Tracking with me? So she gets a good hit of that. So she gets reinvigorated, and then there's a scene where she goes back into to another spaceship, which she has to get back to Earth. And I think this is maybe heavy drama, but she kind of goes back and back and back to the beginning. She goes back to her core. And from that core, and from internalizing, I think I can do this, she gets motivated. She sees what she needs to do. And then she finds that way home. Here she's looking at instructions. She's not crying. She's saying, I can do this. She takes this escape capsule. She ends up back on the earth. And there you go. So as I also look at you, and I've listened to some presentations, how many agree that they learn better with a good story? You remember the story. So as I look out at you, I'm trying to think of a story that you could relate to that embodies these things. So I was a suicide specialist. After I finished training at UCLA, my first mentor created the suicide prevention centers in Washington and Los Angeles. And what would happen is he would see still suicidal patients at UCLA in the inpatient unit, and he discharged them because they weren't acutely suicidal. You couldn't keep them there forever. So they were still suicidal, but they weren't acutely suicidal. And my mentor, Ed Schneidman, who was the pioneer in this thing, would refer them to me. And it was interesting because he'd refer to me always in the same way. I'd get a call, and here's his voice. I can get a little emotional because I miss him. He was one of my early mentors. He says, Mark, this is Ed. I'm with this lovely young woman. I'm with this handsome young man. They're in a lot of pain, Mark. You could help them. See them. So probably about a third of my practice were suicidal people. But everything changed with a patient named Nancy. Nancy had made 3 or 4 suicide attempts, childhood, awful childhood, molestation, rape, abuse. And she'd made 3 or 4 attempts before I started seeing her. She'd been in the hospital 3 to 4 months every year for several years. And I was seeing her, and I didn't think I was helping her at all. I mean, she'd come in 2-3 times a week. She wasn't exactly catatonic, but if you're me, and I'm Nancy, so you're me, she'd be like this. But she would come in right on time. In fact, that little stupid red light that annoys you if you're in therapy, that goes on or whatever, she'd be there like within 10 seconds of that red light. I mean, the red light would go on, within 10 seconds of the scheduled time. So one of the things that I used to do to make some extra money early on is I moonlighted at a state hospital. And moonlighting means you go, you admit patients, you write orders, you do this kind of thing. And sometimes you're up for 36 hours. So there was one weekend where I'm up for 36 hours. And if any of you have ever pulled an all-nighter, you know it does interesting things to your body. Sphincters, your mind. How many have pulled an all-nighter? You know what I'm talking about. So there I am Monday, and I sit down, and I'm not exactly wigged out, but I'm feeling a little, different. And so here comes Nancy. I sit down, and she's like this. And so suddenly, as I'm looking out in the room, all the color turns to black and white. And I go, whoa, wow, that's weird. And then it got very cold. And then it got almost like melting gray metal. So I thought I was having a seizure or a stroke. Now, I'm a medical doctor. I'm a psychiatrist. So she's looking at me like this, so it wasn't that rude. So I did a neurologic exam on myself. So she's like this, and I'm going like this, and 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 like this. She's like this. And I say to myself, I'm all here. I'm not having a stroke or a seizure. And then I thought, I think I'm looking at the world through her eyes. I think I'm feeling how the world looks to her. And because I was sleep deprived, I blurted out something that, when I blurted it out, I thought, probably shouldn't have blurted that out. And I said, Nancy, I didn't know it was so bad, and I can't help you kill yourself. But if you do, and she's like this, but if you do, I will still think well of you. I will miss you. And maybe I'll understand why you had to get out of the pain. And I thought, don't write that in the medical record. You just gave her permission. And she never made eye contact. I'd been seeing her for 6 months. She was coming. She hadn't made an attempt. I didn't think I was helping her. And then she just locks on to me, an eye to eye. And I realized that I had sort of seen things right. And I thought she was going to say, thank you for understanding. I'm overdue. And so I was a little, imagine this, the first time you make eye contact with your psychiatrist and he gets paranoid on you. So she looks at me and I said, what are you thinking? How's that for a first date? And I said, and she said, if you can really understand why I might have to kill myself to get out of the pain, maybe I won't need to. And then she smiled and she let go of her suicidality. And then something happened which I subsequently used with a number of suicidal people. Now again, these are suicidal people who had been through all kinds of therapy, all kinds of medication, shock therapy, group therapy, but I could be innovative. I mean, I was and so what I said to her, and it came from that meeting, because I kept looking in her eyes, and I said, because I didn't want to lose her eyes. I mean, she was looking at me. And I said, if it's okay with you, I'm not going to give you any advice or solutions that you won't follow. And then when you come back, you'll have to tell me why you didn't follow it. And she's engaged. I said, would that be okay? And she's going, uh-huh. And I said, what I'm going to do instead, and what she taught me, is I can look into people's eyes, and I hope maybe during the interactive afterwards, I'm going to give you a taste of being able to do it yourself. And I said, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to find you wherever you are, and I'm going to keep you company there as long as it takes, because you've been there alone far too long, and you've been there alone at 3 a.m., not thinking you would make it to 7 a.m. on more than a few occasions. Would that be okay? And then she starts to cry. And she gave up her suicidality. Now you may be thinking, where did he learn that? That's not like any training I've had. So, because I was trying to figure out, where did I learn that? So there's always a backstory to these kinds of things. One of my greatest accomplishments in life, and with all due humility, I've accomplished a fair amount, but my greatest personal accomplishment is I dropped out of medical school twice and finished. And I didn't drop out to see the world. I was highlighting every book. I was reading it. I was hoping I could retain the information. I couldn't. I was somehow passing. So I took a leave of absence, which they allow you to do. And I worked in blue-collar jobs. I miss them. I mean, the best job, my favorite job, is I worked for a liquor distributing company in Boston. And I got to go into bars and put up those Heineken windmills at the top and the clocks, and I'd negotiate with the barkeeper. I'll give you one for your basement if you keep it for a month. There'd be dead rat skeletons up there. I had found my posse. I mean, really. And this was great, but my mind came back, and then I came back to medical school. And it lasted for another 3 months. So I asked for another leave of absence. And so this is a little bit kind of like in gravity. I came from a background, now some of you are younger, you may not relate to this, but I came from a background with parents who did the best they could, but you're only worth what you can do. If you can't do anything, you're worthless. Now maybe they didn't say that, but that's what I internalized. And so I was at a point where I felt worthless. So Dean William McNary, the Dean of Students, calls me in, and he cared about students. And he's an Irish Catholic in Boston. He says, Mark, this is Mac. Better come in here. Got a letter here from the dean. So the dean of the school is about fundraising. And so I go in, and I'm really sort of at a low point. I don't know that if I'm thinking the yes word, but I'm not that far away from it. And so imagine you come from this background of totally conditional love. Now, my parents did the best they could. I think their parents were worse than they were. So, no, I'm not begrudging them. They were an improvement on their parents, but they came from that conditional love. And so he says, Mark, read this letter. So I read the letter. It's from the dean of the school. And it says, I've met with Mr. Goulston, suggested an alternate career, perhaps the cello. Now talk about someone who really is empathically in tune with people. And I'm advising the promotions that he be asked to withdraw. And I was, I went to Berkeley in the 60s. I mean, so my way of usually coping with things with sarcasm and cynicism, you're foolish if you believe anyone or believe in anything. We're getting back to that. You're foolish if you believe anyone or believe in anything. It's sad. And so, but I didn't have that. I was too far gone. And it was my good fortune that I didn't go the other way into what I would view as pathetic. Oh, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What happened is it felt like a gunshot wound. And I know what a gunshot wound feels like, because 10 years ago I had a perforated colon, and it felt just like that. I almost died. And I said, well, what does this mean? He said, Mark, you've been kicked out. And I go, oh. And then I start rubbing my eyes because I feel like I'm bleeding. And so I think it was a resurrection. Talk about the abyss. I didn't think it was because I wasn't a crier. I was, shut down kind of person. I thought I was bleeding. So imagine from that background, conditional, you're not worth anything. And so this is what Dean McNary says. He says, Mark, you didn't screw up because you're passing stuff. But you are screwed up. But if you got unscrewed up, I think this school would one day be glad they gave you a second chance. So I start to cry. I mean, I'm not bleeding now. I'm crying because I don't know what kindness is. Maybe some of you have had that experience where someone in just the right key looks into your eyes and says, are you okay? And they're not just saying it, to say, are you okay? And then they just sign you off. And sometimes that kindness can touch you. How many people have experienced that unsolicited kindness and it gets to you emotionally? So he says that to me. He says, I think this school would be glad they gave you a second chance. So I can hardly make eye contact because this is too intimate. This is too loving. And then he says, and Mark, even if you don't become a doctor, even if you don't come back to medical school, even if you don't do another thing the rest of your life, I'd be proud to know you because you have goodness in you. And you have no idea how much the world needs that goodness. And you won't know it till you're 35. But you have to make it till you're 35. And I'm a puddle. I can hardly look at any of you. And then he says, look at me. He says, Mark, you deserve to be on this planet. And you're going to let me help you. And I remember looking up at him, and I just said, I think I'd like that. And he set up an appeal. I mean, he was an anatomy instructor. He had to go against the dean of the school, the head of Boston hospitals. He had to set that up, and he did. And I guess they saw goodness in me also. So they gave me a leave of absence. And I didn't know anything about psychiatry, but I needed to get away from the East Coast where I grew up and Berkeley where I knew about Vietnam protests. So I went to Topeka, Kansas, to a place called the Menninger Foundation. And it was one of the early places where they trained psychiatrists. And I hadn't made the connection with Nancy, and I just hung out with schizophrenic farm boys, and we'd walk around in the snow, and I'd just hang out with them. And I remember saying to the psychiatrist, is this legitimate? This doesn't seem like a real doctor. And they said, no, it's legitimate. You know, the other professions don't quite understand it. But no, it's legitimate, and you're pretty good at it. So what happened is I make it through med school. It's still not easy. And remember how I was telling you how if you see gravity, Sandra Bullock is actually keeping a journal with us by talking to us as opposed to being in her mind. It keeps her from having her amygdala hijacking her. That's a part of your emotional brain that sometimes hijacks you away from thinking. So I finally made it through. I'm not a writer back then. And so I take out a little crappy journal. It says record. I mean, it was the cheapest thing you could buy. I think it was 98 cents. And here it is. I didn't even put in volume 1. I didn't think I'd be writing. June 7th, 1977. Free at last. They've released the madman. Today, June 10th, 2007, volume 246. And so what I would like to talk to you about is creating a Traumalog. And if you sign up on the sheet, I'll give you the instructions. But basically what a Traumalog is, if you again think of the movie with Sandra, every time you hit a hiccup in the road, now what happens is if you've been traumatized, especially if you're in the military or you've been raped or you've seen real awful stuff, you hit a bump in the road, you freeze. And you go, you breathe through it, you do some sort of physical thing, you keep busy, but inside you'll know you got past it, but you didn't get over it. Right? And that's good enough. Coping's pretty good when you get that hiccup, that flashback. So the way the Traumalog, and it's L-O-G-U-E, works, and I'll send you instructions if you're interested, is you create a journal, and when you hit a hiccup in the road, you imagine one of your mentors, or you ask yourself. For me, it works. I can call in 6 dead mentors, and what they say to me is, okay, Mark, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? What does it make you want to do? What's your impulse? And then I breathe in these mentors loving me, and they say, Mark, what would be a better thing to do? And you just write it down. And so, can you see how that gives you a way through it? As opposed to, don't shut down, breathe, meditate, mindfulness. And again, there'll be a sign up, and I'll send you an instruction sheet how to use this. Now, something I would like to do to give you a taste, because my book, Just Listen, is about how do you listen into people versus listening to people. Here's an example of the difference. If I'm listening to you, oh, you came to a talk, it's last day of a festival, thank you all for showing, and you want to get some information about coping and healing and really getting over trauma. So if I'm listening to you, I'm checking the boxes. But if I'm listening into you, and if I took most of you and looked into your eyes and say, where you still stuck? How bad does it get for you? What are some of the things you do that make it better for the moment than you feel embarrassed? What's it like at its worst? Do you follow what I'm saying? You would open up. That's kind of what George Clooney did with Sandra Bullock. So something I'd like to shift into is I'd like you to pair up, and you can't be a solo on this, so make sure, just pair up with someone. So you're a solo, go pair up with someone. You got to hear. So yeah, she's looking at you, this guy saying, you're stuck with me. Okay, it's okay. This will work out, trust me. So I want you to pair up with someone. Okay, please. This won't change your life, but it'll be good. So who is unpaired and give me a hard time? Okay, are you giving me a hard time or are you just unpaired? What? Can you pair with someone? Okay. So everyone's paired up. Trust me on this. So to my left, they're going to go first. First of all, I want you to look into each other's eyes. Just look into each other's eyes. Some of you are going to get embarrassed because you don't do this kind of stuff and and you're going to laugh and you're going to giggle. But lock onto each other's eyes and make their face go away. Look into their left eye. There's people who say that the left eye is connected to the right brain. So just keep looking into their left eye. And so the person to my left, ask the person to my right, look into each other's eyes, what is one thing you want me to know about you? And then the person on the right, answer it. Okay, so go on, ask. Okay, and then look back in the interest of time when you got that nailed. Okay, look back. So now what you're going to, and then the other person ask it too. Okay, turn it back. Okay, it doesn't have to be an essay, just what you want to know. Okay, so if you're all finished, look forward. And try and remember what that was like. Now you're going to do the same thing, but what you're going to ask the other person and look into their eyes and say, what is one thing you don't want me to know about you? And I'll go first. What I'd like you to know about me is I am on a personal mission to heal the world one conversation at a time. Something I'm very excited about, unless I get shot, is the Russian government has hired me to come to Moscow to teach them empathy. And I'm going in October. And I told them, I'm not teaching you negotiation. And the people putting it on say, a lot of the people in power don't want this, but everybody here needs that. So I'm very excited about that. So what I want you to know is that it's very important to me that people make the most of their conversations. What I don't want you to know about is I'm a shameless name dropper. And I'm a show-off on media. I mean, if you Google me, you'll say, God, you can't shut this guy off. And now I can get away with it because some of the stuff's interesting, but it's not my best identity. My best identity is when I'm looking into someone's eyes and with no agenda. Here's a good quote. You can write it down. You can remember it. I'll send it to you. It's from Wilfred Bion. He was a British psychoanalyst. He said, the purest form of listening is to listen without memory or desire. Because when you listen with memory, you're listening with an old agenda that you're plugging them into. And when you listen with desire, you listen with a new agenda that you're trying to plug them into, but you're not listening to them or into them. So let's finish the exercise. So the left person asks the right person, what is one thing you don't want me to know about you? Okay, now reverse it, and we still have time for questions, comments, and I'll take whatever's on your mind. But reverse it, and the person on the right asks the person on the left, what is one thing you don't want me to know about you? And don't say, we're breaking up today. No. Okay, so let's bring it. How did it feel? What did that feel? Did you feel judged on the second one? Did you feel like the other person was looking at you like, you're disgusting, you're creepy? Did anyone feel judged? How many people felt accepted? How many people felt more accepted by the other person than you accept yourself for what you talked about? Isn't that interesting? So with that, why don't we open it up to questions, interactive. Happy to, take what's on your mind, any questions.